6 Vanguard ETFs that you could technically own forever. So the idea is, these 6 ETFs from Vanguard, no matter what happens, bear market, bull market, it doesn't matter. You buy these, you hold them over the long term, you're gonna make a lot of money. The first ETF we have today is VOO. This is the Vanguard 500 Index Fund ETF. It's up 41.13% over the past 5 years. The next ETF we have is VTI. This is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund ETF, and this is up 37.14% over the past 5 years. Next we have VXUS, which is the Vanguard Total International Stock Index Fund. This one's actually down 9.52% over the past 5 years. And you might be saying, okay, Robbie, why do you have a ETF that's down over the past 5 years? We're going to talk about it in a second, but let's first discuss these 3 different ETFs, then we're going to go over the next 3. Now, why are we going over these 3 first? Well, these are more broad ETFs, broad market ETFs. So here we're going to compare these 3 ETFs, and then we're going to go over the next 3. So we have VOO here, we have VTI, we have VXUS. Let's move over to the expense ratios. These are very, very cheap funds. 0.03% is the expense ratio for VOO, 0.03% is the expense ratio for VTI, and VXUS 0.07%. This is about as low as you could possibly get. 0.03% for these two is about as low as you could get. There are some Fidelity ETFs that can get this low. Generally, most ETF companies, you do not get this low. This is extremely cheap for an ETF. And even 0.07% is not a lot of money. So these are extremely cheap ETFs. One of the things that we're banking on here is that we're not going to pay a lot of fees when we go and invest. Now, some people like dividends, some people like yield, right? And so these ETFs do give you yield, right? And so they basically send you dividends or yield per year. They all pay you quarterly. And for example, VOO is paying for the distribution yield 1.55%. So if you buy this, if you put $100,000 in, you're going to get 1.55% right now on average for the income that this thing sends you. So $1,550 per year. VTI 1.52, so very similar. And then you actually get a much higher yield for VXUS. One of the interesting things about the international ETFs right now is that they're giving you much more yield than the domestic ETFs here, like VOO and VTI. Like I said, these are broad market ETFs, so they're basically investing in tons of different stocks. So for example, you have 506 holdings in VOO. So technically, it should be about 500 holdings in VOO. There's some other holdings in here like cash equivalents and stuff like that for liquidity for the fund. Don't worry about that. Let's say 500 stocks inside the S&P 500, and VOO tracks all of those different stocks. These are the largest stocks inside the stock market. That's what this ETF tracks. So a bunch of different stocks is what you have exposure to here. Go over to VTI, 4,029 stocks. Hugely diversified portfolio, tons of stocks in this thing. So you're getting even more diversification. 500 is enough. 4,000 is huge, hugely diversified. Then you go over to VXUS, 7,990 stocks. Okay, I don't even know, what do we got? We got extreme diversification, I guess is the word you might say there. So extreme diversification for VXUS. So VXUS has tons of stocks in it, but where are they located, right? So basically what's going on with VXUS, it's an international ETF. It's investing everything outside the US. So every country except the US could possibly, potentially be in here. So what we have here is 29.51% is in Western Europe, excluding the UK. Then Japan, you have 15%. You have Asia emerging. You have Asia developed. You're getting exposure to all these different countries within this ETF. Let's go back up. Let's take a look at the top 10 holdings of these ETFs. So we have VOO with Apple, VTI with Apple. Now we got VXUS, Taiwan Semiconductor. You'll see that these are weighted pretty high in the portfolio. For example, VTI 5.59% of the entire portfolio is in Apple. VOO 6.5% of the entire portfolio is in Apple. Why is that? Because Apple is the largest company in the world, and these weight the larger companies as a bigger part of the portfolio. It's called being market cap weighted. Now, if you've invested $100,000 in these 3 ETFs, which one would have done the best? Okay, take a look at this. So we have the S&P 500 ETF, VOO. $100,000 grows to $400,000 if you had invested back in, let's say, January 1st of 2012. So it's over about a 10-year period. That's how much money you grow to. That is a good chunk of money, $100,000 to $400,000. Then you have VTI, which is $100,000 growing to $386,000, also a great amount of growth. And then you have VXUS, $100,000 grows to $178,000. Obviously, this is not growing as much, and we're going to talk about that in a second. The compound annual growth rates here, 13.55%. This is a huge compounded rate for 10 years. So you do want to make sure that you understand that there are some risks with these ETFs. So for example, the worst time period, so from the peak of one of these to when they actually hit the bottom, there was actually drawdowns of 23.91% for VOO. So your money went from a certain amount of money and it went down 23.91%. So that's a big loss, okay? We're not talking about bond funds in this video. We're talking only about stock funds. So you might want to need to supplement this with a bond fund if that's something that you want to do, because maybe you don't want to take as much risk. That's the deal when you invest. Over the long term, you should be gaining money. Now here's an explanation of why I did include VXUS in this, because there are times where international stocks, they do much better. And an ETF like VXUS will do better in those time periods, and it'll do worse in time periods where international stocks don't do as well as US stocks. And this is a chart that shows us when this has happened in the past. We have 1975 all the way over here. We have modern day right over here, 2022. This mountain chart, right? When this is blue and it's above the line, that's when the US market has outperformed the international markets. And when it's below, the US market has underperformed international markets. So basically what we're seeing is over 11 years that the US market has been outperforming international markets. That's one of the reasons why VXUS has not done as well. But where are we right now? For example, if we're right here, well, that means that VXUS might start doing well as we go down here, as let's say US markets, domestic markets don't do as well as international, and suddenly international and VXUS start doing better. Well, you would want to have exposure to VXUS. That's one of the reasons I basically had it on here. It might not always be the best ETF. I don't know when it's going to start performing well, but at some point in time it is going to. All right, let's move on. We're going to go over some more ETFs, and at the end I'm going to compare all of these so you can see how they all kind of perform together, which ones you can maybe put into a portfolio, create a portfolio of yourself here. So first off, we have the Vanguard Value Index Fund ETF. This is ticker symbol VTV. This is actually up over the past 5 years, 30.85%, so it's done okay. The other one we're adding here now is the Vanguard Growth Index Fund ETF, ticker symbol VUG. This one is actually up 48.20% over the past 5 years. Let's compare these two. I'm going to show you at the very end one extra ETF so we can go over that. That's kind of the cherry on top maybe. So I want to show you why these two ETFs are kind of lumped together, and they're not in the other ones, the broad market ETFs, like the VOO, the VTI, and the VXUS ETFs I just showed you. And so actually there are different styles when it comes to investing. Basically, we group these into different style boxes, okay? And let's say, for example, you have a growth style and you have a value style. Well, VTV invests in the value style and VUG invests in the growth style. And why would you even care about the difference between these two? Well, sometimes the value style does better, sometimes the growth style does better. This is actually a chart from JP Morgan. It's showing on the right side here, these right bars, if it's on the right side of this line here, that means that this style did better when interest rates were rising. It's on the other side, if it's on the left side, it means it does better when interest rates are actually falling. So what we want to focus on here is the style value, right? VTV, that Vanguard ETF, VTV, that's a value ETF. And so it does better when interest rates are rising. And then we have growth. So growth technically should do better when interest rates are falling. The reason I didn't lump in those broad market ETFs with these is because these are more specific. They're targeted towards value or growth ETFs, not towards the general broad market. So one of the ideas here is, well, why don't you buy both of these and hold them instead of just buying a broad index fund? Why don't you buy one of these two and hold them together? We're going to go over that in a second, but I do want to compare these real quick. On the left column here, we have VUG, the Vanguard Growth Index Fund ETF shares. We have VTV on the right side, Vanguard Value Index Fund ETF shares. So both have very cheap expense ratios, 0.04%, about exactly the same as the VOO and VTI ETFs, just a very, very small 0.01% more. So very, very cheap ETFs that you have here. In terms of yields, if you want to see how much these yield, well, the growth ETFs, they don't yield that much money because growth companies tend to reinvest all their money into the company and they don't give dividends out. So you don't get much yield in VUG, the growth ETF, 0.067% or 0.065% for the distribution yield. But in VTV, you get much more yield, 2.32%. So if you care more about yield, a little bit more yield if you're going to go with VTV. Now, in terms of the top 10 holdings, you're going to see a big difference between these ETFs, okay? Apple is the number one in VUG because Apple is a growth stock. But VTV has Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, which is more of an insurance conglomerate. That is the number one stock in VTV. Two very different companies. Either of these two could potentially do better over the long term, so you own both of them. If you're really trying to do a passive investing type of strategy, if you're doing a more active type of strategy, well, you can decide which one you want to own. But we're talking about owning forever in this video, right? So we're talking about long-term, buying both of these and holding them forever. So if you go back to 2004 and you invest $100,000 into both these ETFs, which one does better? Okay, let's take a look first at the Vanguard Growth ETF, $100,000. Goes to $553,000 over that time period. That's a decent chunk of time, right? You got a 10% rate of return, a great compound annual growth rate for this ETF. And then the Vanguard Value ETF, $100,000, grew to $428,000, and it was 8.45% compound annually. Also, a pretty good and great ETF compound annual growth rate. I'd be happy with an 8.45%. I would be happy with a 10% over a long-term period of time. My money would grow very nicely over that time. Here's a chart of these two. Take a look. Now, what if you invested in half of one and half of the other? Does that beat VOO or VTI? Create a portfolio. We're going to back test it. We're going to see which one does better. Okay, portfolio 1, VUG, VTV, 50% each. Portfolio 2, just the Vanguard VOO ETF. Portfolio 3, just the VTI ETF, the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. How do these do? Which does better? Portfolio 1, the 50-50 split, $100,000, grows to $412,000. You invested in the year 2011, basically at the start of the year, and you held it until today. So you did the best actually if you owned a portfolio of half growth and the half value ETF. You actually did better. Actually, very interesting. To me, very interesting. Hope it's interesting to you. If you go with VOO, you have 407,000. You have VTI, you have 390,000. You did the best. You got a compound annual growth rate with a 50-50 portfolio. Of course, you did have bad years. You had down 27%, 23.7% for the worst for one of these, 23%, down 24%, right? So you had years, you had time periods where you did lose a decent chunk of money. But again, hold long term, invest it, keep invested forever. You're going to make a good amount of money. Last ETF to show you, then I'm going to show you a portfolio of all these ETFs combined. So we have the Vanguard High Dividend Yield ETF. This one is actually up over the past 5 years, 25.48%. Now, the interesting thing about this one is it's a dividend ETF. So it's going to be investing in only dividend type of companies. And so dividend companies that pay decent yields. And so this was actually 0.06% expense ratio, just a little bit more than VTV and VUG, pretty cheap still. We have a yield of 2.83%, which is higher than VTV, 2.3%. And then, of course, VUG, 0.67%, very low yield. So again, if you want some income on your portfolio, this one's decent, got decent income. The top few companies, we have Johnson & Johnson, we have ExxonMobil, we have JP Morgan, right? Some similar ones that we had in VTV, but again, it's more of a dividend, solely dividend focused ETF. You have to pay dividends to be inside this ETF. Here we have all the ETFs I've talked about so far today. This is one chart with everything in it. So here we have on the bottom, the purple one, we have VXUS up 4.79%. VTV is the next one, this kind of red rose reddish, 49.25%. Then we have VTI, the black one, 49.29%. Then we have the blue one, VOO, up 54%. And then we have this kind of burgundy looking one, VUG, the growth ETF, that one is up 54.69%. Finally, what's a portfolio look with all of these ETFs combined together? How does that perform against, let's say, VOO? Let's compare portfolio of VOO here, as we can see portfolio 1 versus portfolio 2, which is everything combined. And now I didn't put everything equally. 18% is in every single one of these except for VXUS, which I did 10% VXUS. Let's see how this looks. So VOO actually had a $100,000 grow to $400,000 if you go back until December 31st of 2011 until today. So it did better, VOO. The combined portfolio of all the different ETFs, $100,000, grew to $363,000. Compound annual growth rate, 12.56% versus VOO, 13.55%. They both did okay. They both did really good, actually. But VOO just did better. And so when you compare it, VOO does look better. Let me know in the comments which you like the most. And I got a disclaimer here. I will see you next time.